We think we know the story of the machine. We see it in grainy footage, a box of olive drab steel churning through the mud of some forgotten European field, and we assign it a simple, brutal label. For the M4 Sherman, that label was a curse, a cynical bit of gallows humor whispered in the dark holds of landing craft and the smoky interiors of field tents. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lights up first time, every time, a death trap. A steel coffin. A testament to the cold arithmetic of a war of production, where quantity was its own quality, and the lives of the 5 men inside were just another variable in the equation. That is the story we have been told, the one that has settled like dust over the historical record. It is a simple story, and like all simple stories about complex things, it is a convenient and profound lie. The truth is not found in the final, fiery moments of the tank's life, but in the relentless, thrumming beat of its heart. The truth is a story not of fire, but of endurance. It is a story of a flawed machine, born of compromise and haste, that was willed into greatness not by the designers in their clean drafting rooms, but by the men in the mud, the grease-stained mechanics and the anonymous engineers who listened to the rhythm of its engine and heard a language no one else could understand. They knew the Sherman wasn't a coffin. It was a promise, waiting for the right alchemist to unlock it. The story you think you know is about how the Sherman died. The story we are going to tell is about how it was made to live, to fight, to endure, against all odds and against all regulations. It is about a secret written not in ink on official memoranda, but in the chemical bonds of a forbidden fuel, a mixture that was, for all intents and purposes, illegal. An act of mechanical heresy that made the Sherman's engine, the very thing that was supposed to be its greatest vulnerability, nearly bulletproof. So I need you to do something. Put the world away. Silence the noise that insists on simple answers. We are going into the dark, into the smell of oil and hot metal, into the deafening roar of a radial engine pushed beyond its limits. We are going to a place where a single man's obsession with the hum of a perfectly tuned machine could alter the course of a battle, and by extension, the war itself. It is a quiet story, hidden beneath the thunder of the guns. And to hear it, you have to listen closely. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. The genesis of the M4 Sherman was not an act of confident creation, but a frantic, desperate response to a world consumed by fire. The year was 1940. The place was the collective mind of an American military establishment watching in stunned horror as the Wehrmacht's panzer division sliced through France like a scalpel through soft tissue. The doctrine of the static front, of infantry and artillery, had been rendered obsolete in a matter of weeks. The new god of the battlefield was the combined arms assault, spearheaded by fast-moving, hard-hitting tanks. And America, the sleeping industrial giant, had almost none of them. The nation's armored forces were a sad collection of interwar relics, thin-skinned machines armed with pop guns, more suited for parades than for facing the grim efficiency of a Panzer IV. A terrifying realization dawned in the halls of the Ordnance Department: America was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and the gun was a German 75mm cannon. The immediate answer was a study in panicked compromise, the M3 Grant, a bizarre, asymmetrical beast with a limited traverse 75mm gun mounted in the hull and a smaller 37mm gun in a turret. It was a stopgap, a clumsy but necessary step, designed with one overriding principle: it had to be built now, using existing components. And the most critical component, the heart of this new generation of American armor, was its engine. There was no time to design and tool up a dedicated, liquid-cooled tank engine like the Germans' Maybach or the Soviets' Klimov. The demand was for thousands of tanks, and the only power plant available in sufficient numbers with enough torque to move 30 tons of steel was an engine designed not for the mud, but for the sky. The Wright Arc 975 Whirlwind. A 9-cylinder, air-cooled radial aircraft engine. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, a star of cast iron and aluminum that had powered the planes of Lindbergh and Earhart. It was powerful, relatively lightweight, and most importantly, the production lines were already humming, churning them out for trainer aircraft and blimps. The decision was made. This creature of the air would be crammed into the belly of a terrestrial monster. It was a choice born of pure, unadulterated necessity, and it would cast a long, dark shadow over the machine that was to come. From the DNA of the M3 Grant, the M4 Sherman was conceived. It corrected the most glaring flaw of its predecessor, mounting the 75mm gun in a fully traversing turret. It was designed with a fanatical devotion to mass production. Its parts were standardized, its construction simplified. It was not meant to be the best tank in the world, it was meant to be the tank that was there, on the battlefield, in overwhelming numbers. The foundries of Detroit and the industrial heartland roared to life, and the Shermans began to roll off the assembly lines, first in a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. They were the physical embodiment of the arsenal of democracy, a testament to what a nation could achieve when it turned its full industrial might to the singular purpose of war. But inside every single one of them, bolted into the rear of the hull, was that star-shaped engine, an aviator's heart beating in a soldier's chest, waiting for the test of a war it was never truly designed to fight. The Wright R-975 Whirlwind was a marvel of its time, a symphony of precisely machined parts designed to operate in a fundamentally different world. In an aircraft, it was surrounded by a rushing torrent of cold, clean air at altitude. It drank high-octane aviation gasoline, a carefully refined elixir that ensured a clean, powerful burn. Its operational life was measured in hundreds of hours between meticulous overhauls by specialist technicians. It was a thoroughbred, designed for the clean, open spaces of the sky. In the Sherman, it was a caged animal. Encased in a cramped, poorly ventilated steel box, it was perpetually starved for air. The cooling fans, driven by a complex system of belts and shafts, struggled to pull enough air through the armored grills, which were often clogged with mud, dust, or debris. Instead of the gentle, consistent RPM of cruising flight, it was subjected to the brutal, lurching demands of a tracked vehicle, sudden acceleration, grinding climbs, and long periods of idling where heat would build to critical levels. The engine, designed for the cold, thin air of 10,000 feet, was now choking in the dust of Tunisia and the humid bocage of Normandy. It was a fundamental mismatch of environment and engineering, a compromise that echoed in the metallic cough of every startup and the percussive roar of every advance. The fuel it was forced to consume was another betrayal of its nature. While it was designed for 91-octane aviation fuel, the vast, sprawling logistical tail of the U.S. Army was standardized on 80-octane gasoline. To a quartermaster, fuel was fuel, a fungible commodity measured in millions of gallons. To the R-975, this lower-grade fuel was poison. It caused pre-ignition, or knocking, a violent, uncontrolled detonation in the cylinders that hammered the pistons and connecting rods with devastating force. It left behind thick carbon deposits that fouled spark plugs, clogged piston rings, and gummed up valve stems, slowly strangling the engine's performance. The crews and mechanics could feel it, could hear it. The engine never sounded truly happy. There was always a slight roughness, a hesitation under load, a sense of a machine perpetually at war with itself. The heat it generated was immense, turning the engine bay into a furnace. The exhaust pipes, running from each of the 9 cylinders, would glow a dull cherry red in the dark, a visible manifestation of the thermal stress within. This extreme heat baked the rubber fuel lines, making them brittle and prone to cracking. It thinned the lubricating oil, reducing its ability to protect the metal-on-metal surfaces. The entire system was operating on the ragged edge of its design tolerances, a problem that would remain a constant, nagging vulnerability throughout its service life. And then there was the fire. The reputation of the Ronson was born from a confluence of factors. The Sherman's relatively thin side armor could be penetrated by most German anti-tank guns. When a shell pierced the hull, the spalling, white-hot fragments of the tank's own armor would ricochet around the interior at incredible speed. If these fragments struck the ammunition racks, which were initially stored high in the sponsons on either side of the hull, they would ignite the propellant in the shell casings, creating an instantaneous, catastrophic inferno. This was the primary cause of the fires. But the engine bay was a tinderbox in its own right. A rupture in a gasoline line, a spark from a ricocheting fragment, or simply the superheated exhaust manifolds could ignite the atomized fuel and oil that coated every surface. The gasoline itself, volatile and eager to burn, was the accelerant. While later designs would incorporate wet ammunition storage and move the racks to the floor, the specter of fire was forever linked to the Sherman, and the gasoline-fueled R-975 engine, fairly or not, became the symbol of this fiery vulnerability. It was a magnificent engine in the wrong place at the wrong time, a heart of fire that gave the Sherman life, but also threatened, at any moment, to be the instrument of its death. The men who operated it developed a strange, intimate relationship with the beast in their belly. They learned its moods, the subtle changes in its tone that signaled trouble. They prayed it would start on a cold morning and prayed it wouldn't stop in the middle of a firefight. They lived by its power and died by its flaws. The baptism of the M4 Sherman came not in the green fields of Europe, but in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North African desert. In the autumn of 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein, the British Eighth Army unleashed their new American-built tanks against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The initial impression was one of overwhelming relief. Compared to the undergunned British Crusader and Valentine tanks, the Sherman was a revelation. Its 75mm gun could fire a respectable high-explosive shell, a crucial capability against anti-tank gun positions, and its armor-piercing round was more than a match for the German Panzer IIIs and the short-barreled Panzer IVs that formed the bulk of Rommel's force. The crews loved its reliability compared to their own breakdown-prone British designs, and the power-traversing turret was a godsend. For a brief, shining moment, the Sherman seemed like a war winner. It had a stable gun platform, decent mobility, and a gun that could do the job. The American tankers who arrived with Operation Torch a few weeks later shared that initial optimism. They were confident, well-equipped, and eager to prove their mettle. The desert would be their proving ground. And a brutal one it was. The desert is a relentless abrasive. It is a world of fine, silicate dust that works its way into everything. It gets into the fuel, into the oil, into the air intakes. For the air-cooled R-975, it was a nightmare. The dust clogged the cooling fins, causing the cylinders to overheat. It was ingested through the carburetors, where it mixed with oil and fuel to become a grinding paste, scoring the cylinder walls and wearing away the piston rings with merciless efficiency. Engines that were designed to last for hundreds of hours were being worn out in a fraction of that time. Maintenance crews worked around the clock in makeshift desert workshops, their faces masked with rags, trying to keep the machines running. They improvised new air filters, using whatever materials they could find, but it was a losing battle against the omnipresent grit. And it was in the crucible of North Africa that the Sherman's weaknesses began to reveal themselves. The tank's high profile, a consequence of mounting a tall radial engine in the hull, made it a conspicuous target on the flat, open terrain. And then came the encounters with the new generation of German hardware. The long-barreled Panzer IV Ausf. F2, and the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft gun used in a ground roll. Suddenly, the Sherman's armor felt terrifyingly thin. The German guns could slice through it from distances where the Sherman's own 75mm gun was ineffective. And when the shells came through, the fires started. A crew would be rolling forward, confident in their steel behemoth, and then there would be a deafening crack, a violent lurch, and a sudden, searing wave of heat. The stories began to circulate, grim tales passed in hushed tones from one exhausted crew to another. They spoke of the smell of burning paint and rubber, of the acrid smoke that filled the turret in an instant, and the desperate, frantic scramble to escape through the hatches before the ammunition cooked off. The Ronson legend was born here, in the sun-bleached wadis and rocky passes of Tunisia. It was a nickname that dripped with the black humor of men who lived with death as a constant companion. They knew the primary culprit was the ammunition stowage, but every fire was a gasoline fire in their minds. The engine, the source of their mobility, became inextricably linked with their vulnerability. The fear was palpable. It changed the way they fought, making them more cautious, more reliant on numbers and artillery support. The pressure began to travel up the chain of command, from the tank crews to the ordnance officers, and from there, in urgent cables back to the arsenals and proving grounds in the United States. The machine was good, the report said, but it was not good enough. It was burning. Its heart, the powerful aviation engine, was beating too hot, and the men inside were paying the price in blood and fire. The desert had exposed the flaws in the compromise, and a solution had to be found, not in a laboratory a year from now, but here, on the battlefield, immediately. In the machinery of war, the greatest and most implacable enemy is often not the one with a different flag, but the one that resides within your own ranks, the bureaucracy. For every soldier on the front line, there existed a vast, complex pyramid of support personnel, logistics officers, quartermasters, and ordnance commanders whose job was not to innovate, but to standardize. Their entire world was built on the principle of interchangeability, of predictable supply and demand. A modern army is not an army of individual heroes, it is a colossal industrial process, and its lifeblood is logistics. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, these were the sacred trinity, and their flow from factory to front had to be as smooth and uninterrupted as possible. To this end, everything was ruthlessly standardized. There was one type of 80-octane gasoline for every truck, jeep, and tank. There was one type of engine oil, one specification for grease, one set of replacement spark plugs. This system was not born of malice or stupidity, it was born of a terrible, pragmatic necessity. When you are supplying millions of men and hundreds of thousands of vehicles scattered across multiple continents, you cannot afford the luxury of variation. A single, specialized fuel for the Sherman tank would mean a separate fleet of tankers, separate storage depots, separate jerry cans, and a nightmarish tangle of paperwork that could bring the entire advance to a halt. This rigid adherence to standardization created an institutional inertia, a deep-seated resistance to change, especially change that came from the bottom up. An ordnance colonel sitting at a desk in Naples or London viewed the war through the lens of supply charts and maintenance schedules. To him, a tank was a unit, an asset with a predictable failure rate. The subtle complaints of a crew chief about engine knocking or a platoon sergeant's report on excessive oil consumption were just data points, noise in a system that was, by and large, working. The system was designed to accept a certain level of loss. It was cold, but it was efficient. Any mechanic in a forward motor pool who dared to deviate from this doctrine was committing a cardinal sin. If he decided to use a different weight of oil or adjust a carburetor setting outside of the specifications in the field manual, he wasn't just tuning an engine, he was disrupting the entire logistical chain. If his custom-tuned tank broke down and a standard replacement part didn't fit or function correctly because of his modifications, he had created a problem that the system could not solve. He was, in the eyes of the bureaucracy, a saboteur. This is the environment in which the Sherman's problems were allowed to fester. The engineers at Wright Aeronautical and the designers at the Detroit Arsenal knew the R-975 was not ideal for its role. They knew it would perform better on higher-octane fuel. But the logistics train was immutable. The Army had decreed that 80-octane was the standard, and so the engine had to be adapted to the fuel, not the other way around. This led to compromises in engine tuning, retarded ignition timing, richer fuel mixtures, that reduced the risk of catastrophic knocking but also robbed the engine of power, increased its fuel consumption, and exacerbated the problems of carbon fouling and overheating. It was a system-wide solution that made every single engine perform suboptimally in order to ensure that they all performed predictably. The individual tank crew, facing a German Tiger on a muddy French lane, did not care about logistical predictability. They cared about horsepower, about whether their engine would respond instantly when they needed to back out of an ambush. They cared about the small margin of performance that might mean the difference between life and death. But their pleas were absorbed and neutralized by the sheer mass of the bureaucratic system, a system that prioritized the health of the whole organism over the fate of any individual cell. It was into this world of rigid rules and unforgiving logistics that a new kind of thinking had to be born, an act of rebellion, not with a rifle, but with a wrench and a fuel can. He is a figure who exists in the space between historical fact and battlefield legend. He has no name, no rank that is consistently remembered, no single, verifiable identity. He is the anonymous engineer, the archetypal American tinkerer, a man who saw a problem not as an obstacle, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. He was not a commissioned officer with a degree from West Point, he was more likely a master sergeant, a man who had come up in the civilian world, perhaps as the head mechanic for a fleet of buses or heavy construction equipment. He was a man whose hands were permanently stained with the memory of grease and whose ears were tuned to a symphony that others heard only as noise. He could stand next to a running R975 and diagnose a sticky valve in cylinder number 7 just by the slight tremor it sent through the hull plates. He understood the engine not as a collection of parts depicted in a technical manual, but as a living, breathing thing with its own personality, its own desires, and its own pains. He saw the official reports and the maintenance directives that came down from on high, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who lives by his senses, that they were wrong. He watched the brand new replacement engines arrive from the depots, and he saw them fail in the same ways as the ones they were replacing. He pulled the cylinder heads and saw the same telltale signs, the pitted piston crowns from detonation, the thick, oily soot of an incomplete burn, the warped exhaust valves that had glowed like embers once too often. The official diagnosis was always something simple: operator error, poor quality control, or simply the unavoidable stresses of combat. But the engineer saw a pattern. He saw a systemic sickness, a chronic condition caused by a diet of bad fuel and the strain of an environment the engine was never meant to inhabit. He would talk to the crews of the tanks that came back, and more importantly, he would listen. He listened to the drivers who complained about a lack of power on steep grades. He listened to the commanders who described the engine sputtering and threatening to stall at the worst possible moment. He collected these stories, these fragments of mechanical misery, and assembled them into a single, coherent diagnosis: the heart of the Sherman was being slowly and methodically poisoned. His workshop was a canvas-draped corner of a sprawling motor pool, a small island of obsessive order in a sea of mud and chaos. Here, under the dim glow of a single bare bulb, surrounded by the tools of his trade laid out with surgical precision, he began his unsanctioned work. He read the engine specifications not as a set of rules, but as a starting point. He knew the Whirlwind was an aircraft engine, so he started thinking like an aircraft mechanic. He acquired, through channels best left unrecorded, samples of different fuels. He got his hands on 91-octane aviation gas, the nectar the engine was born to drink. He even managed to secure a jerry can of captured German aviation fuel, a high-performance blend rumored to be over 100 octane. He didn't have a laboratory with chromatographs and mass spectrometers. His tools were his own senses: the color of the flame, the smell of the exhaust, the sound of the engine under load. He would run a test engine on a stand for hours, listening, watching the temperature gauges, and then tearing it down to read the story written on the metal. He was a physician conducting an autopsy, searching for the cause of death before the patient was even pronounced dead. It was a dangerous game. If a senior officer found his stash of non-regulation fuels and additives, he would be facing a court-martial for misuse of government property, at best. At worst, he could be accused of sabotage. But the ghosts of the burned-out tanks he had seen, the quiet, haunted eyes of the surviving crewmen, drove him onward. He was not just fixing a machine, he was trying to save lives, one cylinder at a time. The process was one of patient, methodical alchemy. The engineer knew that simply pouring high-octane aviation fuel into the tanks wasn't a viable solution. There wasn't enough of it, and the pure, undiluted stuff could have its own side effects on an engine designed to be detuned for army use, potentially burning valves if not properly managed. The goal was not perfection, it was optimization. It was about creating a bespoke blend, a combat cocktail that could be mixed in the field using available components to counteract the poison of the standard-issue 80-octane gasoline. He started with the base fuel, the enemy itself. He understood that its primary sin was its instability under compression, its tendency to detonate rather than burn smoothly. He needed to raise its octane rating, to make it more resistant to knock. The most obvious additive was the aviation gas he had hoarded. Through trial and error, running his test engine under varying loads, he arrived at a precise ratio: perhaps 5 gallons of avgas for every 20 gallons of standard gasoline. This was enough to significantly raise the octane, but not so much as to make the supply unsustainable or to require drastic changes to the carburetor settings. The engine immediately sounded happier, the sharp, metallic ping of detonation replaced by a smoother, more powerful roar. But this was only the first step. The lower-grade fuel also lacked the lubricants and detergents found in aviation-grade gasoline. It left behind a residue, a hard, black carbon that built up on the pistons, in the combustion chambers, and on the valve stems, slowly strangling the engine's ability to breathe. The engineer needed to add a cleaning agent, something to dissolve this mechanical plaque. Here, he turned to another substance common in the motor pool, acetone, a powerful solvent used for cleaning parts. A small, carefully measured amount, perhaps only a few ounces per tankful, acted like a detergent, keeping the fuel system clean and preventing the buildup of deposits. The final ingredient was the most unorthodox, the one that truly marked his formula as a piece of battlefield heresy. The R975, being an air-cooled engine with looser tolerances than its liquid-cooled counterparts, consumed a fair amount of oil, some of which would inevitably slip past the piston rings and into the combustion chamber. The standard-issue motor oil was not designed to burn cleanly. He needed an upper-cylinder lubricant, something that could be mixed with the fuel to provide a microscopic film of protection on the hottest parts of the engine, yet burn away without leaving its own residue. His solution was a specific type of light, refined machine oil, sometimes called Marvel Mystery Oil by civilian mechanics back home, or even a small quantity of castor oil, prized for its high-temperature lubricating properties in racing engines. He now had his formula, a precise blend of 80-octane gasoline, 91-octane avgas, a splash of acetone, and a dose of upper-cylinder lubricant. It was a witch's brew, a concoction that defied every regulation in the Ordnance Department's library. It smelled different. The exhaust it produced had a sharper, cleaner scent. To the uninitiated, it was just fuel. To the engineer, it was the cure. He knew the risks. This wasn't just about performance, it was about reliability. His mixture burned slightly cooler than the standard fuel, reducing the thermal stress on the pistons and valves. The improved lubrication protected the cylinder walls from the scouring effects of dust and debris. The cleaner burn meant the spark plugs wouldn't foul, ensuring a reliable spark under all conditions. He had not made the engine indestructible. He had not given it more armor. But he had made it more resilient. He had made it more tolerant of the abuse of combat. He had taken its greatest weakness, its compromised and overstressed heart, and given it the chemical fortitude to endure. He had, in a metaphorical but very real sense, made it bulletproof. Now, he just had to prove it. The first test was a covert operation conducted under the cover of routine maintenance. The engineer selected a single platoon of 4 Shermans, a unit known for its aggressive commander and its string of bad luck with engine trouble. He didn't explain the details to the crews. He simply told them he was trying a new, winter blend, fuel additive that was supposed to help with cold starts. It was a plausible lie, just enough to deflect any casual questions. Working late at night with a trusted subordinate, he mixed his first full batch, carefully measuring the components into 55-gallon drums. The process felt like a conspiracy, the clinking of metal cans and the gurgle of poured liquids echoing in the quiet of the motor pool. Before dawn, the tanks were refueled. The engineer stood back, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of professional detachment, but his stomach was a knot of anxiety. The platoon's commander gave the signal to mount up, and one by one, the 9-cylinder radials coughed to life. The difference was immediate, though subtle. The usual plume of black smoke at startup was noticeably lighter. The rough, rattling idle seemed to smooth out into a deeper, more confident hum. The drivers, men who knew their machines with an intimacy born of countless hours at the controls, exchanged quizzical glances. The tanks felt more responsive, the engines picking up RPMs more quickly, the whole 30-ton vehicle feeling just a little more agile. As the platoon rolled out on its patrol, the engineer watched them go, listening until the sound of their engines faded into the rumble of the distant front. The next few days were a tense vigil. He waited for the dreaded radio call, the one reporting a breakdown, an engine fire, a tank stranded and waiting for recovery. But the call never came. The platoon returned from its first mission with nothing to report but success. The next day, the same. And the next. At the end of the week, the platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran with a face like a road map of France, sought out the engineer. "I don't know what you put in that gas, Sarge," he said, keeping his voice low, "but don't stop. We climbed the ridge past the old church today. We've never made it up in third gear before. Today, we did. And Miller's tank, it always runs hot. The needle is always kissing the red. The last 3 days, it stayed dead in the middle." The whispers started. A driver from another company would sidle up. "Hey, I heard you guys got something special going on over here. My engine's been acting up." The engineer would give a non-committal shrug, but a few days later, that driver's tank would suddenly start running better, too. The illegal mix became a currency, a secret handshake among the men who knew. Its effects were undeniable. The tanks in his care suffered fewer breakdowns. Their fuel consumption, paradoxically, improved slightly because the engines were running more efficiently. Most importantly, in the chaos of combat, that extra bit of responsiveness, that reliable surge of power, was making a difference. A tank that could reverse out of the line of fire a half-second quicker was a tank that came home. A crew that wasn't constantly worried about their engine quitting on them was a crew that could focus on the fight. The legend of the engineers' bulletproof engines began to grow, spreading not through official channels, but in the quiet conversations of men who depended on their machines for their very lives. He was running a rogue operation, a one-man research and development program fueled by stolen supplies and a stubborn refusal to accept the status quo. He knew it couldn't last. The bureaucracy, with its endless paperwork and its obsession with numbers, would eventually notice the anomaly. It was only a matter of time. Inevitability arrived in the form of a visiting logistics officer, a young captain from divisional headquarters with a pristine uniform and a clipboard. His job was to audit fuel consumption and parts requisitions, a task he approached with the zealous precision of an accountant. He noticed a statistical impossibility in the records of the engineers' company. Their operational readiness rates were nearly 15% higher than the regimental average, yet their requisitions for spare engine parts, pistons, rings, spark plugs, were significantly lower. Furthermore, their consumption of 80-octane gasoline was slightly less than expected, while the motor pool's inventory of cleaning solvents and a particular type of lubricating oil showed a small but steady depletion that couldn't be accounted for by normal maintenance. To the captain, this wasn't a success story, it was a crime scene. The numbers didn't add up, and in the world of logistics, numbers were absolute truth. He began to ask questions, sharp, pointed questions that made the company's supply sergeant nervous. He inspected the fuel depot, taking samples and sniffing the contents of unmarked barrels. He had found the loose thread, and he began to pull. The confrontation took place in the engineer's workshop. The captain, flanked by 2 military policemen, stood in the center of the sanctum, his polished boots a stark contrast to the oil-stained concrete floor. He held up a sample jar of the blended fuel. "Sergeant," he began, his voice cold and devoid of emotion, "can you explain this? This is not standard-issue motor fuel. It contains aviation gasoline and unauthorized chemical additives. You have been systematically violating Ordnance Corps directives for months. You have falsified supply records, misappropriated government property, and created a non-standard fuel that could cause catastrophic damage to the engines you are charged with maintaining." The engineer stood silently, wiping his hands on a rag, his face calm. He didn't deny it. He simply looked the captain in the eye. "My engines don't break down, sir," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My tanks come back." The captain was unmoved by this appeal to results. "You have endangered the entire supply chain. What if every mechanic decided to create his own private fuel blend? It would be chaos. You are facing a general court-martial. But as the MPs stepped forward, the flap of the workshop tent was pushed aside. It was the lieutenant of the first platoon he had treated, followed by his sergeant and half a dozen of his men. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim. "Captain," the lieutenant said, his voice respectful but unwavering, "with all due respect, whatever this man did, he did it to save our lives. We were a hard-luck platoon. We lost 2 tanks to mechanical failure in 1 week before he started working on our engines. We haven't had a single breakdown in combat since. You can look at our mission reports. They speak for themselves." The captain was taken aback, his bureaucratic certainty shaken by this unexpected show of solidarity. This was no longer a simple matter of a rogue mechanic. This was something more complicated. The argument escalated, drawing the attention of the company commander and eventually the regimental colonel, a battle-hardened infantryman who cared more about functional tanks than he did about fuel specifications. He listened to the captain's by-the-book accusations and then he listened to the testimony of the tankers. He looked at the maintenance logs, the stark, undeniable numbers that showed the engineers' tanks stayed in the fight longer. He was a pragmatist, a man who understood the brutal calculus of the front line. The choice was clear. The court-martial was quietly and unofficially dropped. The captain was thanked for his diligence and sent back to headquarters with a recommendation that he investigate regional variations in fuel quality. The engineer was given a stern, off-the-record warning never to get caught again. And then, the colonel looked at him and said, "Just make sure my command tank is next on your list." The story of the anonymous engineer and his illegal fuel mix fades from the official record, dissolving into the larger, more chaotic history of the war. There was no medal, no public commendation. His act of rebellion was absorbed by the very system he had defied. Perhaps his formula, or a variation of it, was quietly passed up the chain of command, stripped of its unorthodox origins, and eventually reappeared as a new technical directive for a special fuel blend for high-temperature operating environments. Perhaps it simply remained a local legend, a secret passed from one grizzled mechanic to another, a piece of battlefield lore that helped men make sense of their survival. The truth is, the Sherman's reliability did improve as the war went on. Better air filters, improved manufacturing techniques, and changes in maintenance doctrine all played their part. The introduction of the excellent Ford GAA V8 engine in many later models also solved many of the problems associated with the radial engine. The Ronson reputation, though it never fully disappeared, was mitigated by the introduction of wet ammunition stowage, which drastically reduced the incidence of fires. The tank that fought in the Battle of the Bulge was a more mature and resilient machine than the one that had landed in North Africa. But the legend of the engineer's fuel persists because it speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of war and innovation. It is a testament to the fact that victory is often forged in the margins, in the small, unsanctioned acts of brilliance performed by individuals who are close enough to the problem to see the real solution. Grand strategy and industrial might can put an army in the field, but it is the ingenuity of the soldier and the mechanic that keeps it fighting. The Sherman tank was never the best tank of the war. It was never as heavily armed as a King Tiger or as well protected as a Soviet IS-2. But it was there. It was reliable enough. And it was made better, day by day, by men who refused to accept its limitations. They were the anonymous engineers, the grease-stained alchemists who listened to the heart of their machine and learned its language. They understood that the engine was more than just a collection of parts, it was the embodiment of the tank's will to live. And by healing the engine, they were healing the crew's faith in their machine, and in themselves. The story isn't about a magic fuel formula. It's about the refusal to be a victim of circumstance. It is a quiet, somber reminder that in the face of overwhelming, impersonal forces, a single, determined mind, armed with knowledge and a willingness to break the rules, can make a stand. The thunder of the guns has long since faded, the great machines now sit silent in museums, but the echo of that secret, that defiant act of mechanical care, remains. It is the sound of a heart that was not allowed to fail,